Good afternoon. My name is Matt Howard. I'm with Virtru. I'm joined by my colleague today, Dana Morris, who leads our engineering organization. We wanted to have a quick chat today about the National Cybersecurity Strategy document that was released last week by the Biden administration. Super interesting times as we kind of step back and look at the big picture here. You know, my quick 2 cents on this, Dana, is that having been watching this game play out for a couple of decades now, hate to date myself, this seems to be a big deal. I'm curious to kind of get your perspective, high level, on it.
Yeah, I would agree, Matt. I think it's funny because with Chris Inglis kind of transitioning out of his position, this sort of feels like his coup de grace. He's on the way out the door, and I think back to RSA when he did the keynote, and he made a comment at one point in his keynote about moving away from checklists to focusing on outcomes. And as somebody who's responsible for engineering and operations for a SaaS platform where we spend an inordinate amount of time worrying about FedRAMP checklists and, SOC 2 checklists, and it's not that these things have no value, but at the end of the day, a lot of times they just become you're filling out a checklist and you've met these criteria, but what's the outcome you're driving towards? And it feels like this is a switch towards that, trying to start focusing on outcomes, even if it's not perfect. It's a really interesting first step in that direction, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here for sure that kind of gets to outcomes. Perhaps more than anything is the idea that people who build software for a living might actually find themselves in a new situation altogether as it relates to liability. I mean, historically, as you know, software vendors have been able to put products into the market and sell software to customers and generally kind of absolve themselves of any real liability by virtue of using contracts to explicitly disclaim liability. This seems to put on the table a topic for some type of national discussion, certainly congressional review, the possibility of legislation that would make software companies liable for defects that they put into production, not unlike the automobile industry. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. I mean, if you think about, I just mentioned SOC 2 with FedRAMP, some of these compliance regimes. You only focus on those if you're selling into particular industries where there's other regulations that require them. But if you think about a lot of consumer software, there's no regulation controlling who owns the data, who has to put security around the data, whether that data can be sold. All of those things are happening, and there's really no government sort of oversight. There's no standards being applied to that. So I think this is certainly a move towards maybe starting to put some focus on driving a set of standards that must be met if you're going to sell something. And if you don't meet those standards, there will be consequences. Now, I think the challenge as a software provider thinking through is like, okay, but where do you draw the line between negligence or just not bothering to care, or just moving fast to market and figuring out security stuff later? And draw the line between that and maybe when somebody is doing all the right things and still falls victim to an attack, which is inevitably going to happen to almost every company because the nature of attacks is that they keep changing and they're getting more and more sophisticated and often even backed by state actors. So I think that's going to be the hard part, is figuring out where you draw the line between, somebody being negligent and just not caring, and somebody who is caring but maybe makes a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, that's well said. And I think one of the things I find most fascinating about this particular document coming out of the White House is that it seems to have taken to heart the on one hand, simple concept that software companies shouldn't be allowed to ship software with known defects. That sounds really simple. And if you say it like that, most people would agree. On the other hand, most people don't build software for a living, and they don't actually understand how difficult it really is to govern a software development lifecycle with perfection, which arguably is impossible. So they've put forth in this document this concept of, loosely defined at this point, but this concept of a safe harbor, which I think would do exactly what you were describing, kind of create incentives for software development organizations to kind of do the right thing, adopt best practices, minimize known defects in third-party libraries, do the right things with respect to simple to fix and catch mistakes in first party code and whatever else might be considered, table stakes. And if you're doing the best practices, then maybe you've got yourself into a safe harbor where you don't suffer the liability consequences, even if you're ultimately subject to some type of downstream attack. Is that the way you see it?
Yeah, I think so. I think, I go back to something Chris Inglis said at RSA when he talked about to date, there hasn't been a reason for an organization in a lot of cases to prioritize security over time to market, right? The incentives are set up in a way that without regulation, and with the incentives being beat your competitor to market, get out there first, move quickly, we have to start to try to change that calculus. I think that's what this response from the administration is trying to do, is to change the calculus to say you have to prioritize security as much as you prioritize time to market. If the safe harbor sort of implementation is done correctly, and I don't know exactly what that means yet, but if they do it right, I think it does create this space where you can incentivize organizations to be secure, but not necessarily overly penalize them if they just make an actual mistake. And to your point, you made the comment earlier about the automobile industry. I mean, we certainly see this in the auto industry, right? I mean, they are not penalized for making simple mistakes. They are penalized when they make a mistake and they try to cover it up, or they just don't respond to it. There are actual penalties, there are actual consequences. I think if they can structure it in a similar way and figure out a way to adopt that to software, it could be quite useful, and it actually could make this a positive motion for the software industry.
Yeah.
But equally, if they're not careful, it could get out of control quickly.
Yeah, it's going to be delicate to say the least. I do love the idea of going back and maybe learning from other industries that have gone before us to sort of imagine what this could look like. The automobile industry being the perfect example. I mean, it wasn't in the 70s when Ralph Nader wrote his famous book, Unsafe at Any Speed, which was effectively critical of the automobile industry for not putting things like seatbelts and airbags into cars and not prioritizing safety features. And, through a very long, public service campaign and other efforts, eventually the automobile industry came to conclude, along with regulators, NHTSA and others, that it was in everyone's best interest to prioritize safety features as part of the products that they were selling. And today, when you watch the Super Bowl and you see 10 commercials for car companies, they're all competing on safety features. And you can imagine a future where some software company will sort of maybe compete decidedly on the fact that they're better at security than others, or they're better at privacy than others, or they're just sort of, saying we're different, perhaps not because of our features and functions. We're different because we respect your data more than our competitors. Is that a plausible potential future from your view?
I sure hope so. I mean, that would be exciting. I think for people to actually, differentiate, make privacy and security a differentiator. I think on the hardware side, we've already seen indications of this from Apple. Apple has been, whether leaving aside how their tech works or what your opinions are and how they do what they do, for the last few years, they have actually been running commercials and ads around protection and data privacy and security as a differentiator for Apple as a brand compared to their competitors. Now, I still view them as more of a hardware company, even though they are obviously increasingly software, but they're kind of the marriage of the two. We haven't seen that as much from software vendors that are not cybersecurity vendors, right? We're not seeing that from Facebook, not to single them out, but that's not what we're seeing from those brands yet. I think if we start to see that shift, that would be a positive outcome. If that's one of the outcomes that comes from this push from the administration, is to start to see that become a differentiator.
Yeah, I mean, one thing on that front, just to kind of pick up that thread, it's fascinating to think about companies, software companies, or better yet, cloud infrastructures, public cloud providers, potentially saying to the market, do business with us because we respect the privacy of your data more than our competitors do. And, I mean, certainly Google has, a massive business, which is advertising related and in many respects data driven. And there's a lot to unpack on that side of the equation. But I do think some of the recent work that Google has done with the introduction of client-side encryption, both in terms of their Google Workspace product, as well as some of their EKM solutions for their Google Cloud Compute stuff, it's sort of a new day dawning where, they're saying to the market, come do business with the Google Cloud or the Google Workspace Cloud and manage your own encryption keys in a way where the data that's stored in the Google Cloud is private to you. No one has access to the keys to decrypt it, not even Google. I mean, is that sort of in line with some of what you're thinking?
It is, absolutely. I think they're still operating at the perimeter, but they're certainly, focusing on a differentiated story relative to who owns the keys and who actually can decrypt the data, which is interesting in the case of Google, right? Because then they sort of have two very distinct parts of their business. That's already true, but they're making it even more so. Where on one hand, they're known as a company that collects a lot of data and sells based off of access to that data, their advertising business. And on the other hand, leaning into this idea that Google Cloud and Google Workspace are not that, and in fact, are being increasingly pushed as a default stance of you own the data, you own the keys, and they're very privacy oriented on that side. So it's interesting to have the same organization have sort of two viewpoints that are not diametrically opposed, but are very different businesses with different differentiation. Because clearly the differentiation on the ad side is the fact that they have so much data. They can give you really great access to consumers and really help you target ads to the right people. That's not always negative, right? That it allows a lot of small businesses to compete with large businesses because they can do the same kind of hyper targeting. So like most things in technology, there's a plus and a minus to those two sides. I think that privacy differentiation is certainly something that Google is starting to lean on more, and I think it's going to become increasingly important as people start to realize the problems inherent in how the lack of sort of focus on who owns the data and how well is it protected.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to kind of just highlight, as you and I continue to pick this apart, I've been talking to a number of colleagues in the industry who've been watching this thing unfold now and reflecting in just the last few days since the strategy came out. And a lot of people are harping on the idea that traditional, contract laws gives too much protection to the software vendor. They can hide behind terms and conditions and a EULA. And if certain organizations suffer some kind of a massive breach due to some type of, egregious error in their security operations, they aren't really subject to very significant downstream liability or penalties, by virtue of lawsuits or FTC action that might exist. I would just highlight, for the benefit of everybody who may not be familiar, I kind of agree, but I also kind of disagree, because it wasn't that long ago that Equifax, of course, had a massive breach. And in the wake of that breach, in addition to suffering, like, I forget how big of a loss relative to their public value as a publicly traded company, they ended up settling, I think it was $575 million with the FTC, one of several suits. So clearly, in that particular case, the laws around the edges of the current system, you could argue, held Equifax accountable, absent some sort of software liability that's now going to be contemplated as a result of the strategy memo. But I just think it's interesting to reflect on that. Any quick thoughts?
I think what's interesting is you're seeing I do think that's interesting. I think that the FTC is certainly been more aggressive lately at trying to find instances where organizations are in fact violating those terms and not disclosing it, and sort of holding them to task for the fact that they're not even living up to those agreements, right? So like, it's a liability, it's a EULA, as you pointed out, it's got its terms and conditions. But what we're seeing is also cases where the terms and conditions are not even the terms and conditions that the vendors are following.
Yeah.
And so the challenge you might have on that side is like, well, the teeth just aren't big enough, because clearly they're willing to risk that and pay, like, what was it? Who was it recently? I forget. Better Health, maybe. I don't want to get the name of the company wrong, but they just paid a $5 or $6 million settlement, I believe. $5 or $6 million is not insignificant, but does it have enough teeth to make it to make you change the behavior, right? And I think that's where this push from the administration is to try to put more teeth around it. Now, the question, of course, as we've kind of been talking about throughout this discussion, is how do you manage those teeth and make sure that they're not overly punitive in the other direction?
Yeah. So I want to shift gears for a moment and highlight someone else who I think has been doing some really incredible work on behalf of taxpayers and American citizens on a very, very difficult stage, Jen Easterly at CISA. I had the pleasure of chatting with her last year at an event, and we were talking about this concept of assumed breach. Like, we all go to bed every night, we all wake up every day, and the question is, do we think we've already been breached in some form or fashion? I mean, are they already here? Are they on our doorstep? Are they in our house? And on a practical level, I think everybody kind of knows the answer is yes. And then, one of the things about the, strategy doc from the White House is that it, for the first time, I think, goes really explicit and sort of defines who they are. They being China, they being Russia, and they being predominantly nation states. For a long time, there was a lot of thought about these criminal organizations. I'm not to say that criminal organizations aren't, a big source of risk and breach as well. I'm just suggesting that, from my own view, I'm curious if you agree that this document from the White House sort of goes to another level in terms of identifying the real risk as state sponsored.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see it in like actual writing. It's one of those sort of we're based in DC, and it's sort of a well-known secret, if you will, that's been the case for many, many years. But to have them stated so explicitly is an interesting shift in policy.
Yeah.
And I think, frankly, it's just acknowledging a reality that all of us have known. A lot of your focus lately on post-quantum encryption and those and sort of those pushes has to do with the assumption that those state agencies, those state actors, are collecting encrypted data ahead of the eventual breakthrough that allow them to decrypt it, which is now a concern, right? So there is a lot going on in that realm, and I think you're seeing this sort of shift away from the traditional criminal organization to either it's directly the state itself, or it's a criminal organization that is sponsored by the state indirectly. But in either case, it's got the sophistication and the sort of wherewithal of a country behind it, which is an interesting challenge, right? As a vendor, that's one that's sort of daunting in some regards, to know that you're sort of up against a much, much, much bigger, much more well-funded organization trying to attack you, and you're trying to protect against them with a much smaller budget, a much smaller team, and a much smaller footprint.
Yeah, I mean, case in point, I wonder what, if you could wave a magic wand and fast forward 5 or 10 years from now, let's assume that most, if not all, of these recommendations from this strategy memo are put into place in some form or fashion. And then imagine something like SolarWinds happening. What would be the outcome? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. I mean, the SolarWinds hack in particular was super sophisticated, and
we know nation state sponsored.
Yeah, nation state sponsored, very sophisticated. It's not like SolarWinds was doing something totally wrong, or they were just ignoring best practices. They were doing everything right. And they just fell victim to a very sophisticated attack from a well-funded actor, which is state-backed. No amount of regulation is going to help. Right?
So the theory is, my question would be, under those circumstances, would SolarWinds have been in the safe harbor?
I would assume so, because they weren't doing something directly wrong.
Right. Right. And
I think
probably likely following best practice.
Yes, and I think a lot of the focus now is, for an organization like that, or even like us, where I think the administration is trying to go is, like, if we can get more organizations doing all the right things, we can maybe limit the blast radius, and we can limit the effect of any particular hack. In particular, all the focus on software, bill of materials, and supply chain, right, has to do with trying to minimize the impact of an attack like that.
Yep, 100%. Listen, we're running short on time. There is one last thing I want to bring up. As much as I kind of look at the strategy doc from the White House and sort of think, you know what, it's well done, and it represents, some have argued kind of a seminal point in history as it relates to all of us potentially aligning our thoughts and resources in a common way to up our games. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Time will tell. But one thing I do find that's missing from the current strategy memo, and it's a little disappointing, especially given how much we've seen coming out of DoD and the zero trust security transformation narrative over the last couple of years. There's this obvious focus on identity as critical. You know, endpoints are critical, networks are critical, applications are critical. All of it's important, but certainly there's been a rising tide of emphasis around the data pillar itself, which, from my perspective, being here at Virtru, I think is really refreshing and good to see. I didn't quite see as much of that in the strategy doc from the White House last week as I would have hoped. There was a lot of talk of data and breaches and protection of data, but in terms of like the practical sort of next steps, it was sort of lacking. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I had the same reaction, Matt. I was a little surprised that it didn't at least try to even link to other assets from the DoD and from NIST and other organizations that are driving, zero trust maturity models and zero trust frameworks. And not that those are perfect either, but they're at least starting to try to put some structure around what does it actually mean to put in place a zero trust framework that assumes that you're breached and assumes that there are bad people in your network already, and how do you try to not prevent them from doing anything, but try to limit their access, to limit the blast radius. In particular, when you think about data, if you can move more of some of the controls that you apply at the network or the app, and you can move some of those to the most important data assets in your organization, feels like that would certainly help shrink the blast radius further. So that if you assume that they've already penetrated the network, they're already in your network, they're already collecting things. Well, if you have different classifications and different ways of protecting different pieces of data, then perhaps you can limit them to only accessing some parts of the data as opposed to all of it, right? Versus at the app or network layer, once they get into the app, they're actually usually able to access everything they can see in that app, which is a lot.
Right. And I mean, I think there's a huge amount of value to just imagining that data at rest is encrypted, huge amount of value in imagining that access controls to any of that data would be sufficiently prioritized with some types of, like limited availability, whether that's like some type of management of keys or who knows what, but limiting the blast radius, as you say, limiting lateral movement. I mean, you still have to get business done. You still have to provide access to data. But that brings up the whole other point, which I know we talk a lot about here at Virtru, so I don't want to harp on it too much. But I think there's this other piece of the puzzle, which is business and indeed government requires that data be shared externally with third parties. And so it's one thing to possess data and have proper governance with respect to encryption and access, priority access controls and stuff like that. But it's another thing to imagine, well, you know what, I need to share this data now with this third party, and therefore I want to encrypt and protect the data, and I want to apply a policy, and I want to guarantee that access to that particular piece of information is only available to the person I intend and no one else. And that would be sort of the logical extension, I think, of what we've already seen from DoD and others around sort of the data pillar in the zero trust architectures that have been widely discussed in the last year or so. And anyhow, the fact that it wasn't there seemed like a bit of a miss from my perspective, but no one's perfect. Nonetheless, I think it was a really interesting document. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today about it, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Thanks, Matt. Anytime.
Thank you, Dana. Take care.